All right, let's talk about something pretty much all of us have felt, anxiety. We're going to really unpack it, what it is, where it comes from, and importantly, how to manage it. And everything we're talking about today, it comes straight from our source material. So let's just dive right in.
I mean, who hasn't, right? You know that feeling, your stomach does a little flip, maybe your palms get sweaty? That's just your body's alarm system, totally normal, and it's kicking into gear. It's something we all go through, and it's the perfect starting point for our conversation today.
Okay, so here's the game plan. First, we'll talk about anxiety as this universal feeling. Then, we'll look at that tipping point when it becomes more. We'll cover the whole spectrum, dig into the causes and symptoms, and wrap up with ways to manage it all.
All right, first things first. Let's get one thing straight. Feeling anxious is not weird or abnormal. It is a totally fundamental part of being human. And as you're about to see, sometimes it can actually be a good thing.
Yeah, really. Think about it. You've got a big deadline at work, right? That little bit of anxiety, it can be a motivator. It kind of sharpens your focus, pushes you to get things done. So it's not always the enemy. Sometimes it's exactly what we need to get prepped and perform our best.
So, what's the technical definition? Well, our source material calls it a subjective feeling. It's this internal mix of apprehension, a little fear, some nervousness, maybe some uneasiness. It's this whole complex emotional thing that, definitely doesn't just stay in your head.
And this is so cool because it's exactly what we do here. You can literally see the original handwritten notes. This is the exact definition we're pulling from. It's that direct line to the source that makes everything so clear. Okay, so if a little bit of anxiety is normal, then where's the line? When does it cross over into something else? That's a great question, and it takes us right into our next section, where we're going to look at the difference between that everyday feeling and an actual clinical condition. And this breaks it down so well. On one side, you've got normal anxiety, a reaction to stress. But on the other side, that's where you see the definition of an anxiety disorder. The key words here are excessive and persistent. But the big one, the real turning point, is when it starts messing with your daily life.
And that idea leads us perfectly into the next topic, the anxiety spectrum. Because, it's not like a light switch that's just on or off. It's way more like a dimmer switch. It can be low, it can be high, and there's a whole range of intensities in between.
So our source material gives us these 4 levels. Level 1 is mild. You're alert, you're focused, it's like game day energy. Then you dial it up to moderate. Now your perception starts to narrow, right? It's harder to concentrate. Then comes severe. This is where the physical stuff really kicks in, racing heart, that kind of thing, and your brain just can't problem solve anymore. And at the top, you've got panic. That's a total loss of control, disorganized behavior, and it's actually considered a medical emergency. And once you're in that clinical territory, there are these specific classifications. Our notes point out some of the major ones, like generalized anxiety disorder, that's GAD, which is all about that constant worry. And then there are others you've probably heard of, like panic disorder, phobias, OCD, and PTSD. And each one of these has its own unique set of characteristics.
So why? Why does this happen to people? And what does it really feel like? That's what we're tackling next, the causes and the symptoms.
Here's the most important thing to get right away. There's almost never just one single cause. It's not that simple. It's much more like a really complex puzzle with all these different pieces, biological, psychological, environmental, that all have to fit together.
Let's look at the biological pieces of the puzzle first. We're talking about things like brain chemistry, neurotransmitter imbalances, or maybe a genetic link, something that runs in the family. It could be hormonal changes, the stress from a long-term illness, or even substance use. These are all things happening inside our physical bodies.
Okay, so next up, the psychological side. This is where things like your personality traits can come into play. Maybe low self-esteem, for example. Past trauma is a huge one, of course. Or even just unresolved conflicts from your past that are still kind of hanging around.
And then, of course, there's the outside world. All the stressors from just living life. Pressure from school or your job, financial stress, relationship issues, losing someone you love. Any of these can be a really powerful trigger.
So with all those causes, how does anxiety actually show up? Well, this chart breaks it down perfectly into 4 categories. It's not just one thing. You've got the psychological symptoms, like worry. The cognitive ones, like your thoughts just racing. The physical stuff, like a pounding heart. And then the behavioral part, like when you start avoiding certain situations. It really does affect your whole self.
All right, that brings us to our last section, and honestly, it might be the most important one: how to manage all of this. Because here's the good news, the great news really. Anxiety is incredibly manageable. So let's look at the tools we have.
Broadly speaking, management strategies fall into two big buckets. On one side, you have the non-medical approaches, think therapy, lifestyle changes, coping skills. And on the other side, you've got the medical or pharmacological approaches, basically prescribed medications. And, a lot of the time, the best approach is actually a mix of both.
So if we zoom in on that non-medical side, you've got things like psychotherapy. A really common one is cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, which is all about helping you reframe your thought patterns. But there's also stuff like relaxation techniques, deep breathing, yoga, and major lifestyle changes like exercise and sleep. And of course, just educating yourself and understanding what your personal triggers are.
Now, for the medication side, our source points to a few key types. Antidepressants, like SSRIs, are often the first thing doctors try. Then, for really intense, short-term relief, there are anxiolytics. And for those purely physical symptoms, like if your heart is just pounding before a public speech, something like a beta blocker might be used to help calm that down.
I just have to pause on this one quote from the notes. It says, "Provide reassurance without minimizing feelings." And that is just so powerful, right? It's the difference between saying, "Oh, don't worry about it," and saying, "I get that you're worried and I'm here with you." That simple validation, it's everything.
So as we start to wrap this up, if there's one thing to take away, it's this. Anxiety, whether it's just some nerves before a big meeting or a full-blown clinical diagnosis, is a deeply human experience. But the most important part of that story is that there are absolutely paths to finding balance and getting relief. It is understandable and it is manageable.
And so that really leaves us with one last question to think about. It's not about fixing everything all at once. It's just about that first small step. So what's one small step toward balance you could explore today? Maybe it's just taking a few deep breaths, or going for a quick walk, or even just texting a friend. Just something small. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.